Okay, what's up, YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have another mystery weapon for you guys today, or in this case, a series of mystery vessels for you guys today. Today's mystery weapon is actually a Brazilian ironclad ship, or a series of Brazilian ironclad patrol boats that were used during the Brazilian Civil War of 1932, also known as the Constitutionalist Revolution of 1932. Now, these vessels go by the name of the Barco Blandando. The Barco Blandando or Blandandos were improvised ironclad patrol vessels that were built by the opposition during the Revolution of 1932. Now, despite the word ironclad, these vessels were actually made out of more than just iron. Some were made of iron, some were made of steel, and some were just made of cheap metals that were a mixture of iron, steel, and other cheaper raw materials. Now, these vessels had a displacement of between 3 and 7 tons. They had a main armament. Now, their main armaments are pretty mixed. Some had 1 to 2 7mm Hotchkiss machine guns and a revolving turret, while others were said to have been fitted with small 20 to 37mm deck guns, with some mounting 40 to 47mm deck guns also. These ships had a variety of different lengths, but they usually were only about 20 to maybe 100 feet in length in some rare cases. These ships had an armor thickness of between 5 and 25 millimeters, depending on which materials were used and who built it. And these ships had a speed of about 5 to 10 knots. These ships had a crew of anywhere from 5 to 15 sailors. And yeah, that's pretty much the basics of these vessels. Now, these vessels had rotating turrets similar to the ironclad ships seen during the American Civil War and the ironclad ships seen throughout all of Europe in the 1860s through 1880s, before the ironclad ship was eventually phased out for the pre-dreadnought battleship in the mid to late 1880s. Now, for those of you who are wondering what is the Constitutionalist Revolution, well, in the year 1930, a Brazilian military slash political dictator by the name of Getulio Vargas came into power via a military coup, which was known as the 1930 Revolution in Brazil. 2 years later, most of the public in Brazil felt that Getulio was not following the Brazilian Constitution, so there was an uprising in 1932. This uprising is known as the Constitutionalist Revolution, in English. And it was pretty much a miniature, or I don't know if it was a miniature civil war or a full-scale civil war, because the sources varied. Most of the sources state that it was basically a full-scale civil war, with other sources saying that only about 30 to 40% of the country was actually a war zone, while the rest of the country was pretty stable. So I'm just going to say it was a civil war in 1932. Now, during the Civil War, you saw a lot of improvised weapons and vehicles, and even aircraft. You saw homemade tanks and armored cars. This included some improvised mobile flamethrowers. I made a video a few years ago about weapons of the Paulista Wars, which was another Brazilian conflict. You also saw improvised naval vessels like the ones you see here. I also heard there were improvised submarines, but I couldn't find any photographs of them. You also had improvised infantry weapons. Both sides produced guns for their respective factions. And you also had improvised military-grade aircraft that were usually converted from civilian airplanes like crop dusters and whatnot. But these Barco Blandando ironclad patrol boats are one of the rarer weapons produced during this conflict. I don't know what happened to these vessels after the war. I can't find any information on them, only small amounts of information on how they were used. Now again, these vessels were fitted with turrets similar to the ironclad vessels used during the American Civil War and the ironclad vessels seen being used throughout Europe and in Asia in the late 19th century. These vessels are pretty strange looking. As strange as it sounds, it would be interesting if there was a I don't know, some type of historically accurate video game or something set during this conflict, so you can kind of like World of Tanks or I don't know, War Thunder, but that's not going to happen. I'm just saying I want that because these vessels look so interesting and they would make a good mechanic in a video game. But in terms of real life, real history, these are some of the rarest yet strangest weapons to be used, as by the 1930s, ironclad vessels had pretty much become obsolete. Now, they did have ironclad-like patrol vessels being used in various navies throughout the world, but these vessels were usually referred to as gunboats, whereas these vessels here are literally just miniature ironclad ships, but being built in South America in the 1930s during a major civil conflict in Brazil. Now, I believe some of these vessels were used, not these direct vessels, but I believe there were copies of vessels like this being used during the Chaco War, which was another war that started in the same year, 1932, between Paraguay and Bolivia, but I haven't looked into that yet. So for now, this is all the information I have on these improvised ironclad patrol vessels. You know, these vessels are pretty strange looking. Okay, now that basically covers the basics of this rare Brazilian class of improvised ironclad vessels from the Constitutionalist War of 1932. But there are many other rare Brazilian weapons used by the Brazilian Navy in the years before and after the 1932 revolution in Brazil. So eventually I'm going to have to cover some of those vessels also, the rare ones that is. The rest of the naval vessels, I will just make videos on them, musical videos I guess, unless you guys want me to narrate more videos like this, but on Brazilian naval weapons. Now, the only video I did on Brazilian naval weapons other than this one was the video I did on Brazilian battleships from the 1880s until the 1930s. Now, there are other Brazilian weapons that were used by the Brazilian Navy, so I guess I'm going to have to do a video on those other weapons. Those other weapons includes cruisers, armored cruisers, destroyers, and rare Brazilian submarines, including those improvised submarines I heard about that were used during this 1932 war and the Paulista Wars as a whole. As most people keep forgetting that the Paulista Wars was not one conflict, but a series of conflicts that spanned from the 1920s until just before the Second World War. Other than that, I guess that is it for this improvised Brazilian ironclad that I just found out about recently. Now, this conflict does bring an idea to my head. You know, even though this might sound goofy, but it's still an interesting concept. Now, what if there was a Battlefield or Call of Duty first-person shooter game set during this Paulista conflict or this 1932 revolution, and not just the 1932 Constitutionalist Revolution in Brazil, but what if there was a first-person shooter game set during the entirety of the Paulista Wars from the 1920s through the mid-1930s? You know, that would be an interesting concept for a hypothetical, video game. It doesn't even have to be first person. It could be third person. It could be one of those, immersive, story-driven games, That would be an interesting concept for a video game based on this conflict, the 1932 Constitutionalist Revolution, and the other Paulista Wars as a whole. But what do you all think? Please tell me in the comments section below. And until next time, this was J-Man Time signing off. And if you have any more ideas for future videos, please tell me in the comments section below. And until next time, see ya.